Okay, I've hit the record button, and if you will indulge me, let's begin our reading. So we're starting from the middle of chapter 3 from page 100, and this is the anniversary edition of Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. And we're going to start from this paragraph. Ooh, my mic is a bit too loud, isn't it? We're going to start from this paragraph. There was some discussion that we were in the middle of, that we're sort of rounding out as we start here, about the difference between animal consciousness and human consciousness. And we're going to kind of see why Freire is interested in developing this idea, what it's leading towards. And then we're going to get into what I think is maybe the coolest part of this chapter, the concept of the thematic universe. With no further ado, I'll take one more sip of this cold water and begin. The prop world of animals contains no limit situations due to its ahistorical character. Similarly, animals lack the ability to exercise limit acts, which require a decisive attitude towards the world, separation from and objectification of the world in order to transform it. Organically bound to their prop, animals do not distinguish between themselves and the world. Accordingly, animals are not limited by limit situations, which are historical, but rather by the entire prop. And the appropriate role for animals is not to relate to their prop. In that event, the prop would be a world, but to adapt to it. Thus, when animals produce a nest, a hive, or a burrow, they are not creating products which result from limit acts, that is, transforming responses. Their productive activity is subordinated to the satisfaction of a physical necessity which is simply stimulating rather than challenging. An animal's product belongs immediately to its physical body, whilst man freely confronts his product. And note 16, that is Karl Marx's Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844, page 113. Only products which result from the activity of a being but do not belong to its physical body, though these products may bear its seal, can give a dimension of meaning to the context, which thus becomes a world. A being capable of such production, who thereby is necessarily aware of himself, is a being for himself, could no longer be if she or he were not in the process of being in the world with which he or she relates, just as the world would no longer exist if this being did not exist. The difference between animals who, because their activity does not constitute limit acts, cannot create products detached from themselves, and humankind, who through their action upon the world create the realm of culture and history, is that only the latter are beings of the praxis. Only human beings are praxis, the praxis which, as the reflection and action which truly transform reality, is the source of knowledge and creation. Animal activity, which occurs without a praxis, is not creative. People's transforming activity is. Again, I'd be interested in sort of folks who are, interested in liberation and also have a really strong animal rights sort of understanding, animal liberation understanding, to see how they might retort this, because Paulo's kind of flaming the animals a little bit, but not necessarily. I think it's sort of just to display the difference between how animals act on the universe, out in the world, and how humans do. And it's based on this concept that he's working through about how humans conceive the world, conceive a consciousness, conceive as an existence, and don't just sort of live. And they also don't just have an understanding of the world within their immediacy and within their physical sort of environment, their necessities, their survival. Humans are constantly sort of thinking about themselves. They're sort of constantly thinking about how they reflect on the world, what it is they're supposed to do in the world, larger themes, right? I think the difference between animal consciousness and human consciousness, as Freire posits it, if I were to summarize it, is essentially that there are themes in human thinking. Humans think in themes. Animals don't think in themes. Animals think in, one may say, in actions. And and sort of immediacy. And this becomes an interesting difference and an important difference in understanding why humans do the things that they do, which oftentimes are the things that are extremely destructive, right? Building civilizations, that's not something that animals do, because for animals, there's not really a need or a desire or maybe, you could say an understanding of a larger sort of theme of producing oneself, representing oneself, understanding the world. There is mostly just, or only just, the actions upon one's environment in order to facilitate life. Whereas for humans, the interest in civilizations come from, for instance, questions of what it is to mean the good life. We build civilizations because, yes, we could have continued to live like animals and survive in the wild, but we recognize that upon thinking some themes out for longer term issues and ideas, we can build certain technologies and build certain types of inhabitants that can, assure us longer periods of life, that can assure us the ability to address different things that we're not able to address in this sort of state of nature, if you might say. That's the sort of philosophical phrase, the construct that's quite popular and important in like early sort of philosophical studies. The language this was originally written in was Portuguese, Maverick. It is as transforming and creative beings that humans, in their permanent relations with reality, produce not only material goods, tangible objects, but also social institutions, ideas, and concepts. Note 17, regarding this point, see Carol Kosick, Dialectica de lo Concreto. Dialectica de lo Concreto. Through their continuing praxis, men and women simultaneously create history and become historical social beings. Because, in contrast to animals, people can tri-dimensionalize time into the past, the present, and the future. Their history, in function of their own creations, develops as a constant process of transformation within which epochal units materialize. These epochal units are not closed periods of time, static compartments within which people are confined. Were this the case, a fundamental condition of history, its continuity, would disappear. On the contrary, epochal units interrelate in the dynamics of historical continuity. Note 18. On the question of historical epochs, see Hans Freire, Teoría de la Época Actual. An epoch is characterized by a complex of ideas, concepts, hopes, doubts, values, and challenges, in dialectical interaction with their opposites, striving towards plenitude. I actually need to look what plenitude means really quickly. The state of being full, complete, or abundant. For example, you might say I have a plenitude of snow after your town gets a lot of snow. Okay. Plenitude. The state of being full, complete, or abundant. Striving towards plenitude. The concrete representation of many of these ideas, values, concepts, and hopes, as well as the obstacles which impede the people's full humanization, constitute the themes of that epoch. Excuse me. These themes imply others which are opposing or even antithetical. They also indicate tasks to be carried out and fulfilled. Thus, historical themes are never isolated, independent, disconnected, or static. They are always interacting dialectically with their opposites. Nor can these themes be found anywhere except in the human-world relationship. The complex the complex of interacting themes of an epoch constitutes its thematic universe. So this is key term here. The complex of interacting themes of an epoch constitutes its thematic universe. So again, borrowing from what I sort of said about the difference between animal thinking and human thinking essentially being themes for the human existence, for praxis, for human historical processes, there are thematic universes, which is these interacting themes of an epoch, right? An epoch being this complex of ideas, concepts, hopes, doubts, values, and challenges, and in dialectical interaction with their opposites striving towards plenitude. So a period of time is often what we use to describe epoch. But here Freire notes that an epoch, in his view, is about the ideas and the concepts that are constantly in dialectical interaction with each other. So, for example, one might say the epoch of the social media era is constituted or characterized by questions of autonomy versus, versus safety, questions of popularity versus safety, questions of connectivity versus lack of privacy, individualism, questions of parasociality, what is the right balance to strike in having a healthy parasocial relationship. These are the sorts of questions, and they kind of bump against each other. It's dialectical because, for instance, the theme of parasocial relationships in the social media epoch, we can say, is in dialectical constant motion. So it is constantly in motion between, for instance, ideas of unhealthy parasocial relationships and healthy parasocial relationships, which we're constantly sort of reformulating and constituting, which are often sort of complex, understanding some things that we see as unhealthy parasocial relationships might be healthy for the person involved, but unhealthy for others. Changing, for instance, the conditions involved in parasocial relationships so that they can be healthier. For instance, changing how celebrities are viewed, changing the forms through which we interact to make them safer, etc. Confronted by this universe of themes in dialectical contradiction, persons take equally contradictory positions. Some work to maintain the structures, others to change them. As antagonism deepens between themes which are the expression of reality, there is a tendency for the themes and for reality itself to be mythicized, establishing a climate of irrationality and sectarianism. This climate threatens to drain the themes of their deeper significance and to deprive them of their characteristically dynamic aspect. In such a situation, myth-creating irrationality itself becomes a fundamental theme. Its opposing theme, the critical and dynamic view of the world, strives to unveil reality, unmask its mythicization, and achieve a full realization of the human task, the permanent transformation of reality in favor of the liberation of people. So what does all this mean? There's first of all, a sort of mix of how we interact with these universes of themes, these thematic universes. Some people try to maintain these structures and some work to change them. So for instance, in the social media epoch, some people try to reassert certain things that are part of everyday social life, social structures that are part of parasocial relationships, let's say. For instance, some people try to reaffirm and entrench the importance of certain social media networks. Social media networks try to continuously bolster themselves and establish themselves as maintaining themselves as the foundation of our social media discourse, of our parasocial relationships. And some try to change that. Some try to take social media networks, seeing all the poisonous things that are attached to these capitalistic entities, and establish parasocial relationships outside of merely those bounds, or at least with full recognition of the dangers of these realms, and taking certain parts away from those realms, not engaging with them in those realms. And one of the biggest problems of a thematic universe is the idea of it being mythicized. So instead of a thematic universe being simply, for instance, a limit situation, something that's a part of space and time, a part of where you're at and why, and all the ideas that are in dialectical motion with each other during that time, during that space, most of us are often, taught actually to mythicize these things, as to see them as the way the world works, almost unchangeably, to avoid having to engage with them dynamically. So, for instance, part of our epoch as, let's say, Gen Z millennials, I'm a Zillennial. For Zillennials, we were brought up in a time where there was this epoch established of, for instance, the way that you're supposed to establish yourself, the way that you're supposed to live the good life, things you're supposed to achieve. We grew up with the concept that we're supposed to go to school, get good grades, go to other school, get good grades, graduate, go to other school, get good grades, get a diploma. And once we get a diploma, we'll be able to get into a career. That career will pay us well. We will buy a house. We will settle down in that house, build a family unit, marry, have kids, etc. And we quickly found out the dangers of realizing, the dangers of holding on to that epoch, for one, because it was changing, but also the dangers of being taught that that is the way the world works, rather than a reflection of a specific period of time where that was, a very viable way to live. And so we have so many, so much of the system, so much of our structure, so much of what we're taught, so much of us internalizing that this is what we have to do to this day, even though these constant economic crashes, these constant revelations that are made through the internet, the nature of the job market now, the nature of universities now, and the tuition that they cost, everything is signaling to us that this is not the way that we're supposed to live. This is not the path. This is not viable anymore with the conditions that are in front of us. And yet that causes an extreme amount, for instance, in people who are realizing to some degree that that is true, that that is not viable, but are holding on to that as having to be viable, as having to be the way to live, and not thinking more radically about how to transform, how to act within the epoch they're living in, how to adjust, but also how to build a good world, a better world, rather than try to be reactionary and pull things back to an ideal time, right? So that can affect a lot of lefty politics. A lot of lefty politics being, let's not care about the imperial powers. Let's not care about what goes on outside of our world. Let's not care about protesting for foreign issues. Let's maybe just focus on maybe making progressive changes within the U.S. so that minimum wage is higher and education is more affordable and healthcare is more affordable, and that will be good for the U.S. And that's all we have to focus on so that we can get back to that condition, to that world where, for instance, going to school, getting your diploma, getting your degree, and getting your career and getting your house is all viable again. And this holds us back tremendously from having real radical conversations, from also just living better, from living the way we need to live for the world that's in front of us. Does that make sense? I'm getting into a lot of talking here, and we're going to get into more reading now, but this is some of the stuff that I want to set up for understanding what the thematic universe is and understanding what Freire says about how to deal with these things as educators. That's a cool insight, Maverick. Thank you. And indigenous atomism. Okay. In the last analysis, the themes both contain and are contained in limit situations. The tasks they imply require limit acts. Note 19. I have termed these themes generative because, however they are comprehended and whatever action they may evoke, they contain the possibility of unfolding into again as many themes, which in their turn call for new tasks to be fulfilled. When the themes are concealed by the limit situations and thus are not clearly perceived, the corresponding tasks, people's responses in the form of historical action, can be neither authentically nor critically fulfilled. In this situation, humans are unable to transcend the limit situations to discover that beyond these situations, and in contradiction to them, lies an untested feasibility. In sum, limit situations imply the existence of persons who are directly or indirectly served by these situations, and of those who are negated and curbed by them. Once the latter come to perceive these situations as the frontier between being and being more human, rather than the frontier between being and nothingness, they begin to direct their increasingly critical actions towards achieving the untested feasibility implicit in that perception. On the other hand, those who are served by the present limit situation regard the untested feasibility as a threatening limit situation, which must not be allowed to materialize and act to maintain the status quo. Consequently, liberating actions upon an historical milieu must correspond not only to the generative themes, but to the way in which these themes are perceived. This requirement in turn implies another, the investigation of meaningful thematics. So the untested feasibility thing here, you see that it's about this radical imagination, right? It's about, for instance, these limit situations, they benefit certain people. These thematic universes, these limit situations benefit certain people and they don't benefit other people. And when the people who don't benefit from these limit situations, who are negated, who are harmed by them, who are oppressed by them, recognize them as such and recognize that they are a barrier between their in front of their humanization, they are now able to see that the only thing that is necessary, the only thing that needs to be focused on, is bringing forth something new, bringing forth a potentiality. There's potential for something new there that we don't know exactly how it's going to go, but we have ideas for it and we need to go chase it. We need to go make that thing happen. Whereas the people who benefit from these situations are going to say, no, we don't want that. You're compromising my bag, right? You're compromising my structure, my foundation here. So we can see these kinds of things, for instance, with what's happening now with university demonstrations, the encampments, where you have a lot of people who are opposed to these kinds of protests, even though they're feasibly about, not liking genocide and not liking, violations of human rights and war crimes. People who even say, like, I am on their side, or who I say I don't like war, but they don't want to get into the realm of uncertainty. And so they inevitably act to reinforce the sort of structure that's in place. Generative themes can be located in concentric circles, moving from the general to the particular. The broadest epochal unit, which includes a diversified range of units and subunits, continental, regional, national, and so forth, contains themes of a universal character. I consider the fundamental theme of our epoch to be that of domination, which implies its opposite, the theme of liberation, as the objective to be achieved. Big circle, domination. That's the big theme of our time. It is this tormenting theme which gives our epoch the anthropological character mentioned earlier. In order to achieve humanization, which presupposes the elimination of dehumanizing oppression, it is absolutely necessary to surmount the limit situations in which people are reduced to things. Within the smaller circles, we find themes and limit situations characteristic of societies on the same continent or on different continents, which through these themes and limit situations share historical similarities. For example, underdevelopment, which cannot be understood apart from the relationship of dependency, represents a limit situation characteristic of societies of the third world. That's a smaller circle, but still quite large when you think about it. The task implied by this limit situation is to overcome the contradictory relation of these object societies to the metropolitan societies. This task constitutes the untested feasibility for the third world. Any given society within the broader epochal unit contains, in addition to the universal, continental, or historically similar themes, its own particular themes, its own limit situations. Within yet smaller circles, thematic diversifications can be found within the same society, divided into areas and sub-areas, all of which are related to the societal whole. These constitute epochal subunits. For example, within the same national unit, one can find the contradiction of the coexistence of the non-contemporaneous. Whatever that means. I don't even know how to break that down. Within these subunits, national themes may or may not be perceived in their true significance. They may simply be felt, sometimes not even that. But the non-existence of themes within the subunits is absolutely impossible. The fact that individuals in a certain area do not perceive a generative theme or perceive it in a distorted way may only reveal a limit situation of oppression in which people are still submerged. So this is quite abstract stuff that Paulo Freire is hanging his hat on, is saying that these are necessary ideas. There have to be national themes. There have to be subunits of these themes, of these thematic universes, and they have to have these themes. They have to have these themes, whether or not people recognize them. For instance, a theme of domination, of underdevelopment in the third world. Maybe some countries might not perceive that they're underdeveloped. This is speaking extremely abstractly, right? But let's say, speaking extremely, generally abstractly, you had a country that was in the third world that is within that, first of all, obviously within the thematic universe of domination, because that applies to everybody. It's the most universal, as Freire says. That's his theme. That's his theory. But let's say there's the third world theme of underdevelopment, and then let's say there's a certain third world country, and this is using old language. I know third world is not like the best concept, but you get what I mean, right? Let's say the underdevelopment of Africa that Walter Rodney writes about. Let's say one of those African nations, which within that thematic universe has its own subunit of a thematic universe that has its own, particularities, specifics. But within that, they don't recognize that they have underdeveloped. They don't recognize that they have been underdeveloped. They don't recognize that this is a key theme. That does not mean that the theme isn't there. It just means they don't recognize it, because maybe the situation of oppression, the limit situation of oppression, it has submerged people still. In general, a dominated consciousness, which has not perceived yet a limit situation in its totality, apprehends only its epiphenomena and transfers to the latter the inhibiting force which is the property of the limit situation. Note 20. Individuals of the middle class often demonstrate this type of behavior, although in a different way from the peasant. Their fear of freedom leads them to erect defense mechanisms and rationalizations which conceal the fundamental, emphasize the fortuitous, and deny concrete reality. Does this feel familiar? You guys kind of seeing this? In the face of a problem whose analysis would lead to the uncomfortable perception of a limit situation, their tendency is to remain on the periphery of the discussion and resist any attempt to reach the heart of the question. They are even annoyed when someone points out a fundamental proposition which explains the fortuitous or secondary matters to which they had been assigning primary importance. Right? Individuals of the middle class are often in denial, essentially. This fact is of great importance for the investigation of generative themes. When people lack a critical understanding of their reality, apprehending it in fragments which they do not perceive as interacting constituent elements of the whole, they cannot truly know that reality. To truly know it, they would have to reverse their starting point. They would need to have a total vision of the context in order subsequently to separate and isolate its constituent elements, and by means of this analysis achieve a clearer perception of the whole. Equally appropriate for the methodology of thematic investigation and for problem-posing education. That's the theme. That's the big thing we're trying to do. Problem-posing education, right? Is this effort to present significant dimensions of an individual's contextual reality, the analysis of which will make it possible for him to recognize the interaction of the various components. Meanwhile, the significant dimensions, which in their turn are constituted of parts and interaction, should be perceived as dimensions of total reality. In this way, a critical analysis of a significant existential dimension makes possible a new critical attitude towards the limit situations. The perception and comprehension of reality are rectified and acquire new depth. When carried out with a methodology of conscientisation, the investigation of the generative theme contained in the minimum thematic universe, the generative themes in interaction, thus introduces or begins to introduce women and men to a critical form of thinking about their world. In the event, however, that human beings perceive reality as dense, impenetrable, and enveloping, it is indispensable to proceed with the investigation by means of abstraction. This method does not involve reducing the concrete to the abstract, which would signify the negation of its dialectical nature, but rather maintaining both elements as opposites which interrelate dialectically in the act of reflection. This dialectical movement of thought is exemplified perfectly in the analysis of a concrete existential coded situation. 21. The coding of an existential situation is the representation of that situation, showing some of its constituent elements in interaction. Decoding is the critical analysis of the coded situation. Its decoding requires moving from the abstract to the concrete. This requires moving from the part to the whole and then returning to the parts. This in turn requires that the subject recognize himself in the object, the coded concrete existential situation, and recognize the object as a situation in which he finds himself together with other subjects. If the decoding is well done, this movement of flux and reflux from the abstract to the concrete, which occurs in the analysis of a coded situation, leads to the supersedence of the abstraction by the critical perception of the concrete, which has already ceased to be a dense, impenetrable reality. Okay, so let's try to break that down. Let's try to have an example. This is one thing about Pedagogy of the Oppressed that in the writing I wish there was a bit more of example giving, right? There will be some, but I want to sort of formulate what that means in an actual teaching situation. So Freire's talking about understanding a dialectic by not bringing to the abstract by making the concrete abstract, but by making the concrete taking the concrete, moving to the abstract, and then moving back to the concrete, right? What does that mean? So let's say you have a situation of workers that don't understand why their job is so miserable. Let's say they are workers at a particular graphic design studio. I'm thinking of the cases of like friends of mine. These are workers at a graphic design studio. They're graphic designers, and they just feel like life is hopeless. And in particular, the life that they've chosen is quite bad because the reality of their job to them is one of constant toil, one of constantly not getting rewarded enough for their labor and having other people take credit for their labor, and having to work with companies as graphic designers through a studio that you don't want to work with that are bad companies, right? And they've internalized this as just an inescapable part of the reality, which makes it just this internal darkness, this conflict of, but I want to be a graphic designer. I want to do this work. I can picture myself in a situation where this is working for me. But why is it that it seems impossible? And so what a teacher might do in that situation with good knowledge of the situation, who's really done the work to understand the themes, which Freire will get into, will say, hey, as graphic designers, you are being paid, right? You are being paid poorly because systemically this system is making it so that your labor is not worth as much, right? Because there are so many people within the United States who have not only become trained in graphic design, but have been put through this entire process owned by these large companies, these capitalist entities, in which they incur a ton of debt. What happens when you have debt? You don't have the ability to negotiate a lot when you have debt, because you have to clear that debt. Otherwise, there are consequences. So all of you have this student debt from studying as graphic designers. And not only that, but you have to deal with the cost of living issues. They're not allowing you to have these jobs remotely or bringing these jobs into smaller neighborhoods with reasonable pay. So you're having to move into big cities where cost of living is very high. You have to pay a ton for rent. And they don't have to pay you very much because they know that there's not much better out there. And this is the same situation that is happening across the board in a ton of other industries. And it's not a situation that always existed. Even within this capitalist era, there were time periods where it was a lot better to work as a graphic designer. It was a lot easier for you to own a house and to feel generally better about your needs being met. And there are other countries that pass legislation, which still needs a lot more help, that does help with these issues, where it's better, where you can live better. And in addition to that, there are ways in which workers can band together in order to make demands concrete to their situation so that they can demand, better compensation. Unionization, right? So in the case of you as a graphic designer, it doesn't have to be this way, right? Your situation, you're getting screwed over, and everybody else is getting screwed over by similar things, and that's not going to last forever. And there are ways that you can make that at least a little bit better, if not a lot better, once you start to understand all the other intersecting issues and start to think about how we can do this radically, right? So what I just did was take a job situation of graphic designers, and I moved into the abstract. I described an overall situation, an overall way of, the position that you're in, right? As an object, right? You're not just a subject. You're not just a character in your own story. Now you're recognizing that you are an object in the situation as well. You're being, acted upon by others. And you're being acted upon by others because those others have no reason. They have been given every bit of compensation and help and every bit of resources that they need, so they don't have to give you much more than you already do. But if you put them in a position where they have to, where they suddenly are more precarious in terms of their resources, you bargain and you get to have more compensation. And you can do that through unionization, which is something that you can perhaps start thinking about doing. Unionizing graphic design, radical sort of work within graphic designer collectives. So I took it right back to the concrete there. This is how that applies to your situation. Now, the way that I just did that was a sort of speed run that's not involving me having a ton of knowledge about the situation, so it's not ideal. And it's also not one where I have somebody that I'm speaking with who is able to formulate specifics that I need to understand. But in essence, that will sort of be the path. And it's an example of a path. And it might be that the conclusion that I just drew, because of what I just said, is not the best conclusion. We also don't want to get into the realm of this is the way that it is. It's not anything different, because maybe the person who's the graphic designer might say, hey, I don't incur any student debt. And a lot of the other people that I know within this realm don't have a lot of student debt. The issue is just that the graphic design industry works this way, right? And then I have to be able to be receptive of that and say, oh, well, maybe you have more of insight on obviously you have more insight on the specifics. Maybe the conclusion that I'm drawing is wrong, but let's sort of start to build that conclusion together in that conversation. That is dialectical teaching. That is how you dialectically teach through interactive themes. Sorry if that example was a bit long-winded, but I want to provide those so that you can have some concrete stuff, right? Concrete, bringing the concrete, the abstract. You have some more concrete stuff to tie this to as you read, right? And that's part of what's kind of a little bit frustrating about this book, is that it delves so long into the abstract without doing much into the concrete. Not doing much, which that's the whole thing it's advocating for. It's kind of ironic in that way. But it's a theoretical work, and that's kind of the nature of how these texts are. And it's our job, I think, to do things like this, conversations, live readings, to provide that, right? To engage with it in this way. When an individual is presented with a coded existential situation, a sketch or photograph which leads by abstraction to the concreteness of existential reality, his tendency is to split that coded situation. In the process of decoding, this separation corresponds to the stage we call the description of the situation, and facilitates the discovery of the interaction among the parts of the disjoined whole. This whole, the coded situation, which previously had been only diffusely apprehended, begins to acquire meaning as thought flows back to it from the various dimensions. Since, however, the coding is the representation of an existential situation, the decoder tends to take the step from the representation to the very concrete situation in which and with which she finds herself. It is thus possible to explain conceptually why individuals begin to behave differently with regard to objective reality once that reality has ceased to look like a blind alley and has taken on its true aspect, a challenge which human beings must meet. Right? And it's key that we're not just saying we're leading the blind, right? We're letting people see. But what we're saying is, in fact, this is not a permanent situation. This is not such a situation you simply have to accept as being the reality, as being the unchangeable. This is a limit situation. It is defined by space and time and conditions, specific things, and it is connected to larger themes. And that means there are things that we can do to figure it out and to try to overcome it. And we're not just speaking about it as I'm teaching you how to do that, but as we are figuring it out. And that's one of the key differences that Freire offers that is often so missing, unfortunately, in a lot of leftist talk, because a lot of people are focused as leftists on telling you what to do and telling you how the world works. And your response is to be a good student and say, thank you for showing me the truth. Now I will do as you say. That is not what we're doing here. Freire is key in his intervention of saying that is not going to do anything. The key is to show that you're on that person's side, that you're listening to them, that you're trying to understand them, and that you're trying to figure out the actions together, the solutions together. And that's not something that's just going to be definite. You can just figure out and then roll out of bed and do the same thing every day. No thought. It's thinking every day together. In all the stages of decoding, people exteriorize their view of the world. And in the way they think about and face the world, fatalistically, dynamically, or statically, their generative themes may be found. A group which does not concretely express a generative thematics, a fact which might appear to imply the non-existence of themes, is on the contrary suggesting a very dramatic theme, the theme of silence. The theme of silence suggests a structure of mutism in the face of the overwhelming force of the limit situations. I'm going to pause really quickly here because I need to just do something really quickly. I just had something that I just remembered that I have to do. So we're going to just take like a quick break. Give me like 3 minutes, okay? Okay. I'm paying an invoice. That's the big thing that I have to do. I have to pay an invoice. Should have done this before, but it's fine. Meow. Somebody said meow. What's up, Moni Muppet? All right. We took a slight break there. Actually, also got like a message. Let me check. I got a message from somebody saying that I'm doing a good job. So thank you. Thank you for watching. We're back. So the theme of silence. That's where we're picking up. Thank you, Moni. I'm glad you caught the new song premiere. Generative thematics. A structure of mutism in the face of overwhelming force of the limit situations. So if you don't do the work to conceptualize your world, and you're sort of approaching it with the sense of, I'm just going to keep to myself, not really talk about what's going on, not figure it out, not try to act upon it, not try to recognize it at the very least as a limit situation, you end up in that theme of silence, right? So, for instance, a theme of silence might be the theme of a certain marginalized group in the United States having their voices silenced systemically so that they don't, because it feels like a compromise if they are not able to, like they're forced to compromise their voices in order to live with the situation. That's at the very least the sort of condition that they found themselves in. This is a thing we understand a lot in the cycle of oppression, right? I must re-emphasize that the generative theme cannot be found in people divorced from reality, nor yet in reality divorced from people, much less in no man's land. It can only be apprehended in the human-world relationship. To investigate the generative theme is to investigate people's thinking about reality and people's action upon reality, which is their praxis. For precisely this reason, the methodology proposed requires that the investigators and the people who would normally be considered objects of that investigation should act as co-investigators. The more active an attitude men and women take in regard to the exploration of their thematics, the more they deepen their critical awareness of reality and, in spelling out those thematics, take possession of that reality. Some may think it inadvisable to include the people as investigators in the search for their own meaningful thematics, that their intrusive influence and the intrusion of those who are most interested or ought to be in their own education will adulterate the findings and thereby sacrifice the objectivity of the investigation. This view mistakenly presupposes that themes exist in their original objective purity outside people, as if themes were things. Actually, themes exist in people in their relations with the world, with reference to concrete facts. The same objective fact could evoke different complexes of generative themes in different epochal... Couldn't let me get that sentence out, huh? I'm a very gassy boy. I need y'all to understand that. The same objective fact could evoke different complexes of generative themes in different epochal subunits. There is therefore a relation between the given objective fact, the perception women and men have of this fact, and the generative themes. A meaningful thematics is expressed by people, and a given moment of expression will differ from an earlier moment if they have changed their perception of the objective facts to which the themes refer. From the investigator's point of view, the important thing is to detect the starting point at which the people visualize the given, and to verify whether or not during the process of investigation any transformation has occurred in their way of perceiving reality. Objective reality, of course, remains unchanged. If the perception of that reality changes in the course of the investigation, that fact does not impair the validity of the investigation. I really, really like this idea of the investigation, of considering yourself, for instance, as an educator, to have to be an investigator, especially as you set up your lesson, you set up your understanding. And Freddy's going to get into this in more detail. In order to teach anybody anything, you got to investigate who they are, what their situation is, what their limit situation is, right? And part of that has to be in conversation with them, but also part of that has to be through, extracurricular, let's say, through study. We have to, as investigators, detect the starting point at which the people visualize the given, and to verify whether or not during the process of investigation any transformation has occurred in their way of perceiving reality. What do they think is just a given about life? What do your parents conceive as a given about life? Life is just like this. So that you can understand, okay, this is what they are misunderstanding. At what point did they have to internalize that given? Right? At what point did they have to say, this is reality? In Avatar: The Last Airbender, Zuko, the character of Zuko, he's internalized givens about his reality. He's internalized he's recognized certain objective facts about who he is, the prince of the Fire Nation who has been banished from his nation, banished from his father's empire, on a quest to chase the Avatar. And for him, in order to internalize this and deal with this is just a given about reality. The things that he's been told in his reality are givens. That, for one, he is too weak, he was too insolent, and that's why he was banished from the Fire Nation and embarrassed by his father. And he can only redeem himself by getting the Avatar. Right? For those of you, y'all have watched the show, right? I mean, it's like 5 of you in here. So it's like 12 of y'all. So now you understand that this is not true. As we watch Zuko, it's like, you're not going to, what do you mean your honor? Like, what are you talking about? Obviously, your father was lying. Obviously, he's a bad person who has convinced you of certain things. But for Zuko, who we are trying to investigate to educate him, to educate him otherwise, let's say, we have to understand, at what point has any sort of transformation occurred in his perception of reality, especially during our process of investigating him, right? What's his starting point? And then what sort of processes is he thinking about through that? And what sort of things are starting to change in his mind throughout the course of the series? Yeah, did that work? Did y'all like that? Objective reality, of course, remains unchanged. If the perception of that reality changes in the course of the investigation, that fact does not impair the validity of the investigation. Facts change, things change. We must realize that the aspirations, the motives, and the objectives implicit in the meaningful thematics are human aspirations, motives, and objectives. They do not exist out there somewhere as static entities. They are occurring. They are as historical as human beings themselves. Consequently, they cannot be apprehended apart from them. To apprehend these themes and to understand them is to understand both the people who embody them and the reality to which they refer. But precisely because it is not possible to understand these themes apart from people, it is necessary that those concerned understand them as well. Thematic investigation thus becomes a common striving towards awareness of reality and towards self-awareness, which makes this investigation a starting point for the educational process, or for cultural action of a liberating character. The real danger of the investigation is not that the supposed objects of the investigation, discovering themselves to be co-investigators, might adulterate the analytical results. On the contrary, the danger lies in the risk of shifting the focus of the investigation from the meaningful themes to the people themselves, thereby treating the people as the objects of the investigation. Since this investigation is to serve as a basis for developing an educational program in which teacher-student and students-teachers combine their cognitions of the same object, the investigation itself must likewise be based on reciprocity of action. Aha! So there's a key caveat then to the Zuko example. A lot of the content about certain characters in shows that could be about like these deep political analyses, and sometimes are usually based in sort of this kind of psychological breakdown of, you know, the growth of a certain character, the mind of a certain character, the feelings of a certain character, their character development. And this is an interesting way to understand stories, to understand people. Everybody loves good character development. But character development is not education about a limit situation. Understanding Zuko's story is important, but it's very important that it's not about Zuko. It is about, for instance, the Fire Nation in general in Avatar: The Last Airbender, and young people within the Fire Nation could be the basis of our investigation, in which case, especially, there's a danger in focusing fully on Zuko and his psychology as an individual and not the reality of all of these different people and all these moving parts who we have to be in conversation with. But their conversation cannot be about, this one guy, John, you know? Thematic investigation, which occurs in the realm of the human, cannot be reduced to a mechanical act. As a process of search, of knowledge, and thus of creation, it requires the investigators to discover the interpenetration of problems and the linking of meaningful themes. The investigation will be most educational when it is most critical, and most critical when it avoids the narrow outlines of partial or focalized views of reality and sticks to the comprehension of total reality. Thus, the process of searching for the meaningful thematics should include a concern for the links between themes, a concern to pose these themes as problems, and a concern for their historical cultural context. Just as the educator may not elaborate a program to present to the people, neither may the investigator elaborate itineraries for researching the thematic universe, starting from points which he has predetermined. Both education and the investigation designed to support it must be sympathetic activities, in the etymological sense of the word. That is, they must consist of communication and of the common experience of a reality perceived in the complexity of its constant becoming. What that means, essentially, I mean, we all know what a college itinerary is, right? You go to university and you take courses in college, and they give you itineraries. They give you what's the word that they use? Syllabus, syllabi, where it's like, we're gonna do this, we're gonna do this, we're gonna do this, we're gonna do this, and a lot of the time the syllabus is constructed a certain way. Sorry, I'm getting key important messages. Getting important messages. I'm so busy. I'm such a busy guy. What was I saying? So a syllabus can only work as a syllabus if it's based in an interchange with the students. You know, and this is a great understanding into why college courses and high school courses. Yeah, you missed the first 2 chapters. Go check out Reading with Elliot channel, and you'll see I read the other ones. Feel free to come join us and hang out with us here. These professors construct a syllabus, and it's all about, I'm trying to get across what is in my head, what I think makes sense in terms of the narrative of this thing. And there's a subtle but extremely important difference between that and this syllabus is going to touch on some structure, some order of things, through which we're all going to understand the generative themes. We're going to investigate the generative themes as student teachers, teacher students, and then we're going to draw our understandings. We're going to educate ourselves as part of a class. And this is the type of class that we don't get subject to, a class where the teacher is just a part of the experience with the folks who, yes, does offer guidance, does, present as being the expert ultimately. But how do the students participate? And not in a superficial way of just participating by saying, oh, we're going to put the right color of lighting in the class. We're going to watch a SpongeBob episode because the students want to. But really asking the students, like, okay, so here's the things that we're going to cover. Now, what is it we're trying to understand here? What is it that we don't understand about this thing? What is it we do understand about this thing? Are we correct? And each time sort of constructing the lessons together, right? There has to be a communication and a common experience of reality, perceived in the complexity of its constant becoming. Perceiving it as emotion, basically. The investigator who, in the name of scientific objectivity, transforms the organic into something inorganic, what is becoming into what is, life into death, is a person who fears change. Very important for my leftists out there. He or she sees in change, which is not denied, but neither is it desired, not a sign of life, but a sign of death and decay. He or she does want to study change, but in order to stop it, not in order to stimulate or deepen it. However, in seeing change as a sign of death, and in making people the passive objects of investigation in order to arrive at rigid models, one betrays their own character as a killer of life. I repeat, the investigation of thematics involves the investigation of the people's thinking. Thinking, which occurs only in and among people together seeking out reality. I cannot think for others or without others, nor can others think for me. Even if the people's thinking is superstitious or naive, it is only as they rethink their assumptions in action that they can change. Producing and acting upon their ideas, not consuming those of others, must constitute that process. This is making sense? I can't think for others or without others, nor can others think for me. That's the end of the day. The minute that we're like, I'm thinking for you, this is what's true, this is what you have to understand, we are in very dangerous territory of looking at things that are not real anymore. Thank you, Wayne. People as beings in a situation find themselves rooted in temporal spatial conditions. I love temporal spatial, what a term. Which mark them and which they also mark. They will tend to reflect on their own situationality to the extent that they are challenged by it to act upon it. Human beings are because they are in a situation. And they will be more the more they not only critically reflect upon their existence, but critically act upon it. The praxis. Human beings are because they are in a situation. Big sentence. Everybody write that one down. Human beings are because they are in a situation. Reflection upon situationality is reflection about the very condition of existence. Critical thinking by means of which people discover each other to be in a situation. Only as this situation ceases to present itself as a dense, enveloping reality or a tormenting blind alley, and they can come to perceive it as an objective, problematic situation, only then can commitment exist. Humankind emerge from their submersion and acquire the ability to intervene in reality as it is unveiled. Intervention in reality, historical awareness itself, thus represents a step forward from emergence and results from the conscientisation of the situation. Conscientisation is the deepening of the awareness, of the attitude of the awareness characteristic of all emergence. Thank you, Superstar. Every thematic investigation which deepens historical awareness is thus really educational, while all authentic education investigates thinking. The more educators and the people investigate the people's thinking and are thus jointly educated, the more they continue to investigate. Education and thematic investigation, in the problem-posing concept of education, are simply different moments of the same process. In contrast with the anti-dialogical and non-communicative deposits of the banking method of education, the program content of the problem-posing method, dialogical par excellence, is constituted and organized by the students' view of the world, where their own generative themes are found. The content thus constantly expands and renews itself. The task of the dialogical teacher and an interdisciplinary team working on the thematic universe revealed by their investigation is to represent, in fact, that universe to the people from whom she or he first received it, and represent it not as a lecture, but as a problem. Let us say, for example, that a group has the responsibility of coordinating a plan for adult education in a peasant area with a high percentage of illiteracy. The plan includes a literacy campaign and a post-literacy phase. During the former stage, problem-posing education seeks out and investigates the generative word. In the post-literacy stage, it seeks out and investigates the generative theme. Generative word, generative theme. Let us here, however, consider only the investigation of the generative themes or the meaningful thematics. Note 22, regarding the investigation and use of generative words, see my Educação como prática da liberdade. Once the investigators have determined the area in which they will work and have acquired a preliminary acquaintance with the area through secondary sources, they initiate the first stage of the investigation. This beginning, like any beginning in any human activity, involves difficulties and risks, which are to a certain point normal, although they are not always evident in the first contact with the individuals of the area. Stealth Intel asks, I don't think I understand what a situation is and what it would mean to not be in one. So rather than conceive it as not be in one, and rather than use the term situation, I think the best way to answer this right now in terms of what we're reading is to use the term limit situation, limit-situation, and instead of saying to not be in a limit situation, we're going to say to overcome a limit situation. All that means is I recognize that I have a limit situation going on. What does that mean? So I recognize that I am, let's say, a mid-20s student who graduated college, and I don't know what I want to do for a career. The job market is terrible. I have not a lot of money. I'm relying on my parents a lot more than I would like to. And I'm trying to figure out something to get me to feel like I have something going on in life, some sort of purpose. I'm trying to understand like how to get the amount of money that I need. And frankly, I'm sort of feeling like the world is messed up, but I don't really know what to do about it. I don't think that there's anything that can be done about it. What I have to recognize is that I'm in a limit situation. That differs from I'm in even a situation, but even to say that I'm in a, that this is just life. What you see with a lot of folks in my comment section, a lot of folks on the internet, is that everybody's in a limit situation. Everybody's in several limit situations. This is Freire's idea. But people talk as if life is the same for everybody. And people talk as if life is just the way that it's going to be. They have just these ideas that are predetermined. They have these ideas that they're not challenging, that they have these things that they refuse to think about very deeply. So you have all these kinds of congregations of people saying things that they haven't thought very deeply about as sorts of ways to sort of cope, or sort of ways to sort of evaluate that the world is just like this, and try to make themselves into the type of person that can benefit in that world. This is so common the way that we live. Whereas we have to understand we're in a limit situation, which Freire says, this is something we can overcome. Anything is something that will change, that will overcome, that can be overcome over time, or that at the very least can be acted upon with the intention of overcoming it. You don't have to take it lying down. You can see that there are all these, you can learn what the world is like. You can learn what these conditions are that make your life the way that it is. And then start to act in ways to try and say, I'm not going to be in that situation anymore. Because it's a limit situation. It's a limit situation. There's a lid on it. It is not that the world has simply like that there's just no way to get past this ceiling. You know, most people conceive of the world as you have a big boulder that is above you that you can never get out of. Overcoming a limit situation is recognizing that that is not an immovable boulder. That is a roof that over time is affected by different things, that is there for a reason, and that we can start to think about, okay, how do I move this? How do I not move this? Where do I go? You know, what do I do about this thing? So we try to overcome our limit situations, right? Sort of like if you think about the Plato, the cave allegory, right? Okay, so once the investigators have determined the area in which they will work and have acquired a preliminary acquaintance with the area through secondary sources, they initiate the first stage of the investigation. Yay. This beginning, like any beginning in any human activity, involves difficulties and risks which are to a certain point normal, although they are not always evident in the first contact with the individuals of the area. In this first contact, the investigators need to get a significant number of persons to agree to an informal meeting during which they can talk about the objectives of their presence in the area. In this meeting, they explain the reason for the investigation, how it is to be carried out, and to what use it will be put. They further explain that the investigation will be impossible without a relation of mutual understanding and trust. If the participants agree both to the investigation and to the subsequent process, the investigators should call for volunteers among the participants to serve as assistants. Note 23, according to the Brazilian sociologist Maria Edi Ferreira, in an unpublished work, thematic investigation is only justified to the extent that it returns to the people what truly belongs to them, to the extent that it represents not an attempt to learn about the people, but to come to know with them the reality which challenges them. To answer, Jem, your question, what is the difference between limit situations and choices? A choice you can sort of define as just what humans choose to do, right? And a limit situation is a series of conditions that we understand are a limit that can be overcome, that can be acted upon. So the choices are what we do when, in the instance that we don't know it's a limit situation, and we just accept that, you know, in a sectarian way as like the way that life is supposed to be, then we make a bunch of choices to accept that life is that way and justify it and make it so that we don't have to, you know, that we try to sort of succeed within that construct. The world is just greedy. Greed is good. There's no way around it. Greed is just the only thing that works, so I'm going to have to be more greedy in order to live. Versus understanding a limit situation. You make different choices by saying, the world seems to be very greedy. Why? What, you know, specifically about my situation, do I feel like is being impacted by greed? And do I really need to be more greedy to overcome it? Because that's all that's going to do is just reify the same world. It's just going to make the world the same way. I'm not going to do that. I'm instead going to try to act upon this situation to overcome it in some way. Does that make sense? Those are the choices we make, are how we reflect on this situation being temporary, being impermanent, being something that can change, that can be acted upon. And then we choose, our choices are just choices, right? Like we can understand them the same way you understand a choice. These volunteers will gather a series of necessary data about the life of the area. Of even greater importance, however, is the active presence of these volunteers in the investigation. Meanwhile, the investigators begin their own visits to the area, never forcing themselves, but acting as sympathetic observers with an attitude of understanding towards what they see. While it is normal for investigators to come to the area with values which influence their perceptions, this does not mean that they may transform the thematic investigation into a means of imposing these values. The only dimension of these values which it is hoped the people whose thematics are being investigated will come to share, it is presumed that the investigators possess this quality, is a critical perception of the world, which implies a correct method of approaching reality in order to unveil it. And critical perception cannot be imposed. Thus, from the very beginning, thematic investigation is expressed as an educational pursuit, as cultural action. During their visits, the investigators set their critical aim on the area under study as if it were for them an enormous, unique, living code to be deciphered. They regard the area as a totality, and visit upon visit attempts to split it by analyzing the partial dimensions which impress them. I got a spam call. Through this process, they expand their understanding of how the various parts interact, which will later help them penetrate the totality itself. This all makes sense, right? We split our understanding of things up into parts to get a better understanding of the whole. During this decoding stage, the investigators observe certain moments of the life of the area, sometimes directly, sometimes by means of informal conversations with the inhabitants. They register everything in their notebooks, including apparently unimportant items: the way people talk, their style of life, their behavior at church and at work. They record the idiom of the people, their expressions, their vocabulary, and their syntax. Not their incorrect pronunciation, but rather the way they construct their thought. Note 24. The Brazilian novelist Guimarães Rosa is a brilliant example of how a writer can capture authentically, not the pronunciation or the grammatical corruptions of the people, but their syntax, the very structure of their thought. And there's a whole conversation to be had about, like, what is the difference between something that is grammatically incorrect and something that is just a unique syntax, right? For instance, we understand AAVE, this is me diverging. We understand AAVE, African American Vernacular English, used to be known as Ebonics. We understand that to be its own syntax, its own way in which people talk, and that also specializes in regions. So there's a difference between that and something that's grammatically incorrect, grammatical corruptions, right? Saying certain things that you don't actually mean with your language. I think that's the key difference. A lot of the times, AAVE is used in ways that it looks to the standard English as being incorrect grammatically, but it's correct to express the specific thoughts of those people, right? A person who's using it might use it specifically because it expresses a thing specifically that you can't express with regular English, quote unquote. And then you have a lot of instances, no matter what speaker you are, where you say things that are grammatically incorrect, grammatically corrupt, you can say, incorrectly pronounced, because you've been taught improperly about the world around you. Back to the note. Indeed, and this is not to disparage his exceptional value as a writer, Guimarães Rosa was the investigator par excellence of the meaningful thematics of the inhabitants of the Brazilian hinterland. Should I be saying Guimarães Rosa? Brazilians, let me know. Professor Paulo de Tarso is currently preparing an essay which analyzes this little considered aspect of the work of Grande Sertão, Veredas, in English translation, the devil to play in the backlands. It is essential that the investigators Observe the area under varying circumstances. Labor in the fields, meetings of a local association, noting the behavior of the participants, the language used, and the relations between the officers and the members. The role played by women and young people, leisure hours, games and sports, conversations with people in their homes, noting examples of husband-wife and parent-child relationships. No activity must escape the attention of the investigators during the initial survey of the area. After each observation visit, the investigator should draw up a brief report to be discussed by the entire team in order to evaluate the preliminary findings of both the professional investigators and the local assailants. To facilitate the participation of the assistants, the evaluation meetings should be held in the area itself. Jem with the response, I don't think that map holds up. Settings are shaped by choices, and the focus right now seems heavy on the idea that limit situations need to be drawn out of the setting and revealed as prior choices. Yeah, the prior choices is a key part of the limit situation. There are also, things that, like, it depends on sort of what your definition of choices is, but for instance, there are parts of limit situations that might not be about human choices, but about, for instance, natural environments. So a limit situation of a worker who is in rural Mexico might be defined by, in addition to the choices that are being made upon his environment, upon his situation, are also just sort of about where is he located, right? They're sort of about, like, what is the sort of nature of the area, of the land? How is the land behaving? And a lot of the things that the land will do is the basis of human choices, like climate change. But I think that there's some distinction that you can make by saying a limit situation, a setting, is not just prior choices. Do you know what I mean? I feel like we're on the same page. The evaluation meetings represent a second stage in the decoding of, no problem, just ice, in the decoding of the unique living code. As each person in his decoding essay relates how he perceived or felt a certain occurrence or situation, his exposition challenges all the other decoders by representing to them the same reality upon which they have themselves been intent. At this moment, they reconsider, through the considerations of others, their own previous consideration. Thus, the analysis of reality made by each individual decoder sends them all back, dialogically, to the disjoined whole, which once more becomes a totality, evoking a new analysis by the investigators, following which a new evaluative and critical meeting will be held. Representatives of the inhabitants participate in all activities as members of the investigating team. Jem asks, maybe limit situations are defined by the feeling of struggle and choices acceptance. I think you can kind of say it that way. Limit situations are defined by there being certain themes that one can act upon to transform that limit situation into a different reality. And so, yes, there's a struggle that has to take place in order to transform that limit situation. They're not necessarily defined by a feeling of struggle, but that you can say that they're defined by a choice to struggle in order to transform that limit situation. That would bypass this need to account for a line between human and non-human elements of the participation anyway. You can sort of say that, yeah. That might be a way, like, that might be an interesting sort of tie into a conversation about Freire's conception of animal consciousness and what he may be getting wrong. Limit situations are moments of leverage. I think limit situations, you can be in you're in a limit situation. You can say you're in several limit situations, and many of them you might not recognize that you're in, right? So it's not just about being defined by the choice to struggle. It's about being defined by whether or not you choose to struggle. Do you know what I mean? It's not, you don't only become you don't only enter a limit situation when you choose to act on it. You're in a limit situation, and upon recognizing it, then you choose to act on it, right? The more the group divide and reintegrate the whole, the more closely they approach the nuclei. There's a lot of usage of this word. Nuclei, I think, is how it's pronounced. The nuclei of the principal and secondary contradictions, which involve the inhabitants of the area. By locating these nuclei of contradictions, the investigators might even at this stage be able to organize the program content of their educational action. Indeed, if the content reflected these contradictions, it would undoubtedly contain the meaningful thematics of the area. And one can safely affirm that action based on these observations would be much more likely to succeed than that based on decisions from the top. The investigators should not, however, be tempted by this possibility. The basic things, starting from the initial perception of these nuclei of contradictions, which include the principal contradiction of society as a larger epochal unit, is to study the inhabitants' level of awareness of these contradictions. What are people understanding about their situation? You know what I mean? That's good to hear, Jem. Intrinsically, these contradictions constitute limit situations, involve themes, and indicate tasks. If individuals are caught up in and are unable to separate themselves from these limit situations, their theme in reference to these situations is fatalism, and the task implied by the theme is the lack of a task. I love that wording. Thus, although the limit situations are objective realities which call forth needs in individuals, one must investigate with these individuals their level of awareness of these situations. Similar thing with the idea of the silence, right? The mutism. These are conditions that are part of the limit situations that we then have to recognize. If the people are not recognizing the limit situation, part of that limit situation is then the fact that they don't recognize it. So they may be fatalistic. There's no tasks. They don't think that there's anything that they can do. They think that they're just fated to whatever. A limit situation as a concrete reality can call forth from persons in different areas and even in sub-areas of the same area, quite opposite themes and tasks. Thus, the basic concern of the investigators should be to concentrate on the knowledge of what Goldman calls real consciousness and the potential consciousness. Real consciousness is the result of the multiple obstacles and deviations that the different factors of empirical reality put into opposition and submit for realization by the potential consciousness. Note 25, Lucian Goldman, The Human Sciences and Philosophy. Real consciousness implies the impossibility of perceiving the untested feasibility which lies beyond the limit situations. But whereas the untested feasibility cannot be achieved at the level of real or present consciousness, it can be realized through testing action, which reveals its hitherto unperceived viability. The untested feasibility and real consciousness are related, as are testing action and potential consciousness. Goldman's concept of potential consciousness is similar to what Nuclei terms unperceived practicable solutions, our untested feasibility, in contrast to perceived practicable solutions and presently practiced solutions, which correspond to Goldman's real consciousness. Note 26, see André Nicolai, Comportement économique et structures sociales. Whatever. Accordingly, the fact that the investigators may, in the first stage of the investigation, approximately apprehend the complex of contradictions does not authorize them to begin to structure the program content of educational action. This perception of reality is still their own, not that of the people. So we're talking about the ideas of recognizing a situation, having real consciousness of that situation, and then the idea of what's potentially possible, which are often in big contradictions with each other. They fight each other often, right? And there's often like a lot of leftism that's like, let's talk about what's actual and what's the real consciousness. Let's not talk about the potential. So we can just lament things being bad, you know? It is with the apprehension of the complex of contradictions that the second stage of the investigation begins. Always acting as a team, the investigators will select some of these contradictions to develop the codifications to be used in the thematic investigation. Since the codifications, sketches or photographs, are the objects which mediate the decoders in their critical analysis, the preparation of these codifications must be guided by certain principles other than the usual ones for making visual aids. Note 27. The codifications may also be oral. In this case, they consist of a few words presenting an existential problem, followed by decoding. The team of the Instituto de Desarrollo Agropecuario, Institute for Agrarian Development in Chile, has used this method successfully in thematic investigations. So these are our codifications, right? The first requirement is that these codifications must necessarily represent situations familiar to the individuals whose thematics are being examined so that they can easily recognize the situations and thus their own relation to them. It is inadmissible, whether during the process of investigation or in the following stage when the meaningful thematics are presented as program content, to present pictures of reality unfamiliar to the participants. The latter procedure, although dialectical because individuals analyzing an unfamiliar reality could compare it with their own and discover the limitations of each, cannot precede the more basic one dictated by the participants' state of submersion. That is, the process in which individuals analyzing their own reality become aware of their prior distorted perceptions and thereby come to have a new perception of that reality. So give examples that the people understand. Give the concepts that the people recognize from their own reality. You know? An equally fundamental requirement for the preparation of the codifications is that their thematic nucleus be neither overtly explicit nor overtly enigmatic. Don't be too controversial, and don't be too, I'm going to lecture you about it. Right? Don't be too sectarian about it. Don't be too banking concept of education about it. The former may degenerate into mere propaganda with no real decoding to be done beyond stating the obviously predetermined content. The latter runs the risk of appearing to be a puzzle or a guessing game. Since they represent existential situations, the codifications should be simple in their complexity and offer various decoding possibilities in order to avoid the brainwashing tendencies of propaganda. Excuse me. Ooh, burping. Codifications are not slogans. They are cognizable objects, challenges towards which the critical reflection of the decoders should be directed. In order to offer various possibilities of analysis in the decoding process, the codifications should be organized as a thematic fan. As the decoders reflect on the codifications should open up in the direction of other themes. This opening up, which does not occur if the thematic content is either too explicit or too enigmatic, is indispensable to the perception of the dialectical relations which exist between the themes and their opposites. Accordingly, the codifications reflecting an existential situation must objectively constitute a totality. Its elements must interact in the makeup of the whole. So you take one part of the situation that you can open up into conversations about the other parts of the situations that are important parts of the totality, right? In the process of decoding, the participants externalize their thematics and thereby make explicit their real consciousness of the world. As they do this, they begin to see how they themselves acted while actually experiencing the situation they are now analyzing, and thus reach a perception of their previous perception. By achieving this awareness, they come to perceive reality differently. By broadening the horizon of their perception, they discover more easily in their background awareness the dialectical relations between the two dimensions of reality. By stimulating perception of the previous perception and knowledge of the previous knowledge, decoding stimulates the appearance of a new perception and the development of new knowledge. The new perception and knowledge are systematically continued with the inauguration of the educational plan, which transforms the untested feasibility into testing action, as potential consciousness supersedes real consciousness. So we have to have an important, it's an important part of learning that the people who are learn what they previously understood. I saw the world this way. How did you see the world? You told me, explained to me all these different things, and we talked through them. And now you get to say, oh, okay, so I was thinking that it was XYZ. And when you do that, that sets you up to say, but actually it's XYZ. It's ABC, whatever. I should have different letters. Hey, Debbie. Preparing the codifications further requires that insofar as possible, they should represent contradictions inclusive of others, which constitute the system of contradictions of the area under study. Note 28. This recommendation is made by Jose Luis Fiori in an unpublished manuscript. As each of these inclusive codifications is prepared, the other contradictions contained therein should also be codified. The decoding of the former will be dialectically clarified by the decoding of the latter. In this connection, a very valuable contribution to our method has been made by Gabriel Baudet, a young Chilean civil servant in one of the most significant Chilean governmental institutions, the Instituto de Desarrollo Agropecuario. Note 29. Until recently, INDAP was directed by the economist and authentic humanist Jacques Chonchol. So INDAP is the acronym. During his use of this method in the post-literacy stage, Baudet observed that the peasants became interested in the discussion only when the codification related directly to their felt needs. Any deviation in the codification, as well as any attempt by the educator to guide the decoding discussion into other areas, produced silence and indifference. On the other hand, he observed that even when the codification centered on their felt needs, the peasants could not manage to concentrate systematically on the discussion, which often digressed to the point of never reaching a synthesis. Note 30, these codifications were not inclusive in Fiori's definition. Also, they almost never perceived the relationship of their felt needs to the direct and indirect causes of these needs. One might say that they failed to perceive the untested feasibility lying beyond the limit situations which engendered their needs. Baudet then decided to experiment with the simultaneous projection of different situations. In this technique lies the value of his contribution. Did I read note 30? I think I did. He terms, initially he projects a very simple codification of an existential situation. He terms this first codification essential. It represents the basic nucleus and opens up into a thematic fan extending into auxiliary codifications. After the essential codification is decoded, the educator maintains its projected image as a reference for the participants and successively projects alongside it the auxiliary codifications. By means of the latter, which are directly related to the essential codification, he sustains the vivid interest of the participants who are thereby enabled to reach a synthesis. In a simpler way of understanding it, you have the start thing. You have to have the essential codification. That is the basic thing. That, you start with one basic thing that is an essential thing that explains something very simple about the sort of felt needs, that connects to the felt needs of the students. So you start with the students with the idea of being broke. And then you go from there into having all these conversations about why is it that students are struggling with being broke? What does it mean to be broke? What kinds of broke are we talking about? How are they different from each other? And we talk about each student, like their situation of brokenness. And then we go from there into fanning into auxiliary codifications, the ideas of student loans, the ideas of taxes, the ideas of cost of living, the ideas of consumption. Are we over consuming? Are we broke as we think we are, etc.? The great achievement of Gabriel Baudet is that by means of the dialectics between the essential and the auxiliary codifications, we have like 7 pages left. By means of the dialectics between the essential and auxiliary codifications, he has managed to communicate to the participants a sense of totality. Individuals who are submerged in reality, merely feeling their needs, emerge from reality and perceive the causes of their needs. In this way, they can go beyond the level of real consciousness to that of potential consciousness much more rapidly. You see that? So we started from the idea of like students being broke, and maybe it's like a bit of a giggly thing, maybe it's a bit of a mixed bag. We have conversations about that, and then we start fanning into these auxiliary codifications that are not really that auxiliary. We start connecting it to these causes, and then all of a sudden the students are no longer feeling like, just being broke is just a part of life. Like I just have to accept this as the reality, and it sucks, and it's making my life really bad. And now they get to say, this is a limit situation. Certain things are causing this, and we can do something about this. We can understand the causes. The causes are important to understand. They're important parts of our lives. And now all of a sudden, the students are conceiving of, capitalism and the student loan industrial complex, for instance, and debt as essential parts of their lives, so that when they hear about student like loans and debt in the news, they can connect those things with their own lives. This is how we teach, right? We teach also by being students, but we teach through connecting with what the students are trying to learn. And if they don't understand what they're trying to learn, understanding what their problem is. What is their problem? What is their issue that they're dealing with? And then expanding that issue into other things. Hello, Diosa. I agree. This is an awesome part. Once the codifications have been prepared and all their possible thematic facets have been studied by the interdisciplinary team, the investigators begin the third stage of the investigation by returning to the area to initiate decoding dialogues in the thematic investigation circles. Note 31, each investigation circle should have a maximum of 20 persons. There should be as many circles as necessary to involve as participants, 10% of the area or sub-area being studied. These discussions, which decode the material prepared in the preceding stage, are taped for subsequent analysis by the interdisciplinary team. We're building the investigation of the context of these people, of these students' lives, let's say. Note 32, these subsequent meetings of analysis should include the volunteers from the area who assisted in the investigation and some participants of the thematic investigation circles. Their contribution is both a right to which they are entitled and an indispensable aid to the analysis of the specialists. As co-investigators of the specialists, they will rectify and or ratify the interpretations the latter make of the findings. From the methodological point of view, Their participation gives the investigation, which from the beginning is based on a sympathetic relationship, an additional safeguard. The critical presence of representatives of the people from the beginning until the final phase, that of thematic analysis, continued in the organization of the program content of educational action as liberating cultural action. You see, we're just building knowledge of the students by building knowledge of their context, by studying the people from the area, for instance, talking to the people from the area, having them involved in the investigation from the beginning to the end as equal parts of it to us. Okay, now we understand them. This is how we understand the limit situations that these people live in. Gem. So limit situations are an analytic frame for naming the crises we're in by following the feelings we feel today into the parts of those crises we can access today. Yeah, I think that's a good summation. Yeah, we name the crises we're in, the issues the problems, right? Our problems. This is what we mean by problem posing education. You see what that means? We pose a problem, and we don't pose it by saying this is your problem. We pose it by asking what is the students, what are the problems that they're facing, and then we take that and we say, okay, let's build a whole plan for understanding the context of that problem, and then through that building these kinds of codifications, right? These symbols, these words, these presentations, these audio pieces, all this stuff that connects the felt needs, the things that they feel, with causes, with actual situations, with real facts in front of them, with dialectics, of course, too, so that they can go from, oh, I just thought that the world was like this. I think the world is like this, and there's just nothing we can do about it, and it sucks. And even that is a step in a lot of cases. And then saying, oh, this is a context. This is a contextual situation, a limit situation that I can act on in some way. And that it's important to act on in some way. Not just I can change it, but like it has to be a part of us as humans to change it. We as humans have to change it. That's a liberation understanding. Thank you, Elise. Have a good night. In addition to the investigator acting as a decoding coordinator, 2 other specialists, a psychologist and a sociologist, attend the meetings. Their task is to note and record the significant and apparently insignificant reactions of the decoders. I love also, this is a team. You have to build teams that are people on equal footing to teach, truly teach. Part of the problem with modern education too is all on the teacher, one individual teacher, to figure all this stuff out. That's a big problem. During the decoding process, the coordinator must not only listen to the individuals, but must challenge them, posing as problems both the codified existential situation and their own answers. Due to the cathartic force of the methodology, the participants of the thematic investigation circles externalize a series of sentiments and opinions about themselves, the world, and others that perhaps they would not express under different circumstances. In one of the thematic investigations carried out in Santiago, a group of tenement residents discussed a scene showing a drunken man walking on the street and 3 young men conversing on the corner. The group note 33, this particular investigation was unfortunately not completed. So we have a group of tenement residents discussing a scene of a drunken man walking on the street and 3 young men conversing on the corner, right? The group participants commented that the only one there who is productive and useful to his country is the souse who is returning home after working all day for low wages and who is worried about his family because he can't take care of their needs. He is the only worker. He is a decent worker and a souse like us. What does a souse mean? Not this dish. A souse is a drunkard. So they're saying, you get this thematic investigation that they're doing, right? Where they're talking about all they do is just bring a scene forward of something recognizable from the students' life, this tenement residents, right? And they perceive fully, with their knowledge of the world, That drunkard is the guy who's cool. Those students are just sitting around talking, right? And that's that alcoholic, that drunkard. He's a hard worker who's concerned about real world things and is getting drunk like many of us do. We relate to him. That's the connection that they made, right? The investigator had intended to study aspects of alcoholism. The psychiatrist, note 34, the psychiatrist Patricio Lopez, whose work is described in Educación como Práctica de Liberdade. He probably would not have elicited the above responses if he had presented the participants with a questionnaire he had elaborated himself. If asked directly, they might even have denied ever taking a drink themselves. But in their comments on the codification of an existential situation they could recognize, and in which they could recognize themselves, they said what they really felt. This is the key part of why we need the codifications. Right? What is a codification? We have like a legal definition here, but that legal definition is based on you have something written, you have something formulated, right? So in legal terms, it's the action or process of arranging laws or rules according to a system or plan. But in this case, we're talking about we have to build a code of a system, symbols, visuals, things that you'll notice these are not connected to the individual students' answers about their personal lives. If you would just go ask around, are you drunk? Do you like to drink? The students don't go, yes, I do, right? They don't reveal all these important feelings about this alcoholic. They do so because you presented them with a codification. You presented them with a code. And that code is safe from their own personal sort of world that they're sort of stuck in, or there's certain personal things that they're concerned about. It's a code for them to process and to respond to. And that's how you get their real answers about how they see their world, right? There are two important aspects to these declarations. On the one hand, they verbalize the connection between earning low wages, feeling exploited, and getting drunk. Getting drunk as a flight from reality, as an attempt to overcome the frustration of inaction, as an ultimately self-destructive solution. On the other hand, they manifest the need to rate the drunkard highly. He is the only one useful to his country because he works while the others only gab. These are quotes, right? After praising the drunkard, the participants then identify themselves with him as workers who also drink, decent workers. They wouldn't have gotten there had you not had the codification, right? In contrast, imagine the failure of a moralistic educator, sermonizing against alcoholism and presenting as an example of virtue something for which for these men is not a manifestation of virtue. See note 35, see Niebuhr Obsite. So imagine this moralistic educator. In this and other cases, the only sound procedure is the conscientisation of the situation, which should be attempted from the start of the thematic investigation. Obviously, conscientisation does not stop at the level of mere subjective perception of a situation, but through action prepares men for the struggle against the obstacles to their humanization. So if you were a moralistic educator trying to teach about, alcoholism, trying to learn about alcoholism to stop students from being alcoholics, let's say, the 9 out of 10 times you're going to get this is why alcohol is bad. This is what it does to you. This is what it does to you. This is what it does to your human existence, which is wrong. This is not the way that you should exist as a human being. You should exist this way as a human being. And that's the easy way to just not teach the lesson. Not only to put off your students, but you're just not even really teaching them, because ultimately you have to assume when you're giving those things that they all have the same virtues as you, they all have the same wants as you, and that they all should just trust your guidance. But and then you don't even learn anything about the students and what they actually perceive. So you can't even bring them to understanding how this alcoholism affects their lives in a real way. There's so many problems with that moralistic propaganda stuff. Stealth Intel, slam jamming the DARE program here. Very good example. Don't do drugs. Drugs are bad, right? Help me understand, Why should I think that drugs are bad if my life is way different from yours, if my virtues are way different from yours? You don't understand me, so you can't tell me what it's good or bad for me. In another experience, this time with peasants, I observed that the unchanging motif during an entire discussion of a situation depicting work in the fields was the demand for an increase in wages and the necessity of joining together to create a union to obtain this particular demand. 3 situations were discussed during the session, and the motif was always the same. Now imagine an educator who has organized his educational program for these men, consisting of reading wholesome texts in which one learns that the water is in the well. But precisely this type of thing happens all the time in both education and politics, because it is not realized that the dialogical nature of education begins with thematic investigation. Thematic investigation. Once the decoding in the circles has been completed, the last stage of the investigation begins, as the investigators undertake a systematic interdisciplinary study of their findings. Listening to the tapes recorded during the decoding sessions and studying the notes taken by the psychologist and the sociologist, the investigators begin to list the themes explicit or implicit in the affirmations made during the sessions. These themes should be classified according to the various social sciences. Classification does not mean that when the program is elaborated, the themes will be seen as belonging to isolated categories, but only that a theme is viewed in a specific manner by each of the social sciences to which it is related. The theme of development, for example, is especially appropriate to the field of economics, but not exclusively so. This theme would also be focalized by sociology, anthropology, and social psychology, fields concerned with cultural change and with the modification of attitudes and values, questions which are equally relevant to a philosophy of development. It would be focalized by political science, a field concerned with the decisions which involve development, by education, and so forth. In this way, the themes which characterize a totality will never be approached rigidly. It would indeed be a pity if the themes, after being investigated in the richness of their interpenetration with other aspects of reality, were subsequently to be handled in such a way as to sacrifice their richness, and hence their force, to the strictures of specialties. It's so important to be interdisciplinary, essentially. Once the thematic demarcation is completed, each specialist presents to the interdisciplinary team a project for the breakdown of his theme. In breaking down the theme, the specialist looks for the fundamental nuclei which, comprising learning units and establishing a sequence, give a general view of the theme. As each specific project is discussed, the other specialists make suggestions. These may be incorporated into the project and/or may be included in the brief essays to be written on the theme. These essays, to which bibliographic suggestions are annexed, are valuable aids in training the teacher students who will work in the culture circles. During this effort to break down the meaningful thematics, the team will recognize the need to include some fundamental themes which were not directly suggested by the people during the preceding investigation. The introduction of these themes has proved to be necessary and also corresponds to the dialogical character of education. If educational programming is dialogical, the teacher students also have the right to participate by including themes not previously suggested. I call the latter type of theme hinged themes due to their function. They may either facilitate the connection between two themes in the program unit, filling a possible gap between the two, or they may illustrate the relations between the general program content and the view of the world held by the people. Hence, one of these themes may be located at the beginning of thematic units. The anthropological concept of culture is one of these hinged themes. It clarifies the role of people in the world and with the world as transforming rather than adaptive beings. Note 36. With regard to the importance of the anthropological analysis of culture, see Educação como Prática de Liberdade. So, further into sort of what the team has to do, right? You're breaking down the meaningful thematics. You're recognizing as you go on, okay, we're going to have to adjust some things. We're going to have to introduce some themes that sometimes the students themselves are not going to have to, like, we can't just pull everything from just the students alone. We're going to have to do this investigation in part to bring in our own themes that the students didn't bring up. And the students also can be the ones to suggest that. When the students suggested, it's a hinged theme, right? The hinged themes are what the students suggest should be the themes of the lesson. And so that's where culture comes in. Culture clarifies the role of people in the world and with the world as transforming rather than adaptive beings. We see that culture is constantly shifting and shaping and changing. And so if we closely look at that, we see, hey, that's how humans are. That's how the world is. It's not just locked. Once the breakdown of the thematics is completed, there follows the stage of its codification, choosing the best channel of communication for each theme and its representation. Note 37, note that the entire program is a totality made up of interrelated units, which in themselves are also totalities. The themes are totalities in themselves, but are also elements which in interaction constitute the thematic units of the entire program. The thematic breakdown splits the total themes in search of their fundamental nuclei, which are the partial elements. The codification process attempts to retotalize the disjoined theme in the representation of existential situations. In decoding, individuals split the codification to apprehend its implicit theme or themes. The dialectical decoding process does not end there, but is completed in the retotalization of the disjoined whole, which is thus more clearly understood, as are also its relations to other codified situations, all of which represent existential situations. No, this will not be on the exam, Alex. A codification may be simple or compound. The former utilizes either the visual, pictorial, or graphic, the tactile, or the auditive channel. The latter utilizes various channels. Okay, we have a chart here, note 38. Codification. A, simple. Visual channel, pictorial, graphic, tactile channel, auditive channel. Or B, the compound, simultaneity of channels. So we have simple things. A simple codification is that picture of the drunkard and the students from that lesson. That's a visual channel, and it's a simple one. The compound one is, there's a picture, there's audio, there's pictorial stuff, there's tactile stuff, there's conversation. So we merge multiple different things. The selection of the pictorial or graphic channel depends not only on the material to be codified, but also on whether or not the individuals with whom one wishes to communicate are literate. After the thematics has been codified, the didactic material, photographs, slides, film strips, posters, reading texts, and so forth is prepared. The team may propose some themes or aspects of some themes to outside specialists as topics for recorded interviews. Let us take the theme of development as an example. The team approaches two or more economists of varying schools of thought, tells them about the program, and invites them to contribute an interview on the subject in language comprehensible to the audience. If the specialists accept, an interview of 15 to 20 minutes is taped. A photograph may be taken of each specialist while he is speaking. When the taped interview is presented to the culture circle, an introductory statement indicates who each speaker is, what he or she has written, done, and doing now. Meanwhile, the speaker's photograph is projected onto a screen. If, for instance, the speaker is a university professor, the introduction could include a discussion regarding what the participants think of universities and what they expect of them. You see how we're shaping this? We're not just presenting a video, we're talking about it beforehand, we're talking about the themes. The group has already been told that the recorded interview will be followed by a discussion of its contents, which function as an auditive codification. The team subsequently reports to the specialist the reaction of the participants during the discussion. See you, Diosa. This technique links intellectuals, often well-intentioned but not infrequently alienated from the reality of the people, to that reality. It also gives the people an opportunity to hear and criticize the thought of intellectuals. So this is something we try to practice sometimes in video essays. We do interviews, and we try to interlink the understanding of who these people are within the videos, and then give the interviews in the videos, right? You see this tactic done in documentaries sometimes, and really good ones, right? That are really educative. But a lot of times it's just throw this person on there. You're supposed to just assume that this person's right, etc., etc. You're not supposed to think about who this person is. Very problematic documentary sleight of hand that's very common. We're almost done here. Some themes or nuclei may be presented by means of brief dramatizations containing the theme only, no solutions. The dramatization acts as a codification, as a problem-posing situation to be discussed. Another didactic resource, as long as it is carried out within a problem-posing rather than a banking approach to education, is the reading and discussion of magazine articles, newspapers, and book chapters, beginning with passages. And there's a whole thing. I could go into so many details, so many rants in this, but we're low on time too. But I could go on and on about sort of the complexities and the difficulties of assigning readings, especially now, and how many professors are choosing to lash out at the students instead of like thinking about how to overcome the limit situation. As in the case of the recorded interviews, the author is introduced before the group begins, and the contents are discussed afterward. Along the same lines, it is indispensable to analyze the contents of newspaper editorials following any given event. Why do different newspapers have such different interpretations of the same fact? This practice helps develop a sense of criticism so that people will react to newspapers or news broadcasts not as passive objects of the communiques directed at them, but rather as consciousness seeking to be free. With all the didactic material prepared, to which should be added small introductory manuals, the team of educators is ready to represent to the people. But represents, I think, is the better pronunciation in this case, to the people their own thematics in systematized and amplified form. The thematics which have come from the people return to them, not as contents to be deposited, but as problems to be solved. See how important that is? You see this? The first task of the basic education teachers is to present the general program of the educational campaign. The people will find themselves in this program. It will not seem strange to them since it originated with them. The educators will also explain, based on the dialogical character of education, the presence in the program of the hinged themes and their significance. Excuse me. Ooh. If the educators lack sufficient funds to carry out the preliminary thematic investigation as described above, they can, with a minimum knowledge of the situation, select some basic themes to serve as codifications to be investigated. Accordingly, they can begin with introductory themes and simultaneously initiate further thematic investigation. One of these basic themes, and one which I consider central and indispensable, is the anthropological concept of culture. Whether men and women are peasants or urban workers, learning to read or enrolled in a post-literacy program, the starting point of their search to know more and the instrumental meaning of the term is the debate of the concept. Man, this is making me so inspired to I want to do a PhD program now about Paulo Freire and education in the social media era. Content education. This is making me so... Woo! As they discuss the world of culture, they express their level of awareness of reality, in which various themes are implicit. Their discussion touches upon other aspects of reality, which comes to be perceived in an increasingly critical manner. These aspects in turn involve many other themes. So again, culture is such a great way to do this for any educational situation. It's almost a cheat code if you can't do much of this stuff to at least root your teaching of these students in culture. Study the culture. Understand them through their culture. Talk to them about culture, you know? With the experience now behind me, I can affirm that the concept of culture, discussed imaginatively in all or almost or most of its dimensions, can provide various aspects of an educational program. In addition, after several days of dialogue with the culture circle participants, the educators can ask the participants directly, what other themes or subjects could we discuss besides these? As each person replies, the answer is noted down and is immediately proposed to the group as a problem. One of the group members may say, for example, I'd like to talk about nationalism. Thank you, guys. Very well, says the educator, noting down the suggestion, and adds, what does nationalism mean? Why is a discussion about nationalism of any interest to us? My experience shows that when a suggestion is posed as a problem to the group, new themes appear. If in an area where, for example, 30 culture circles meet on the same night, all the coordinators, educators, proceed in this fashion, the central team will have a rich variety of thematic material for study. The important thing, from the point of view of libertarian education, is for the people to come to feel like masters of their thinking by discussing the thinking and views of the world explicitly or implicitly manifest in their own suggestions and those of their comrades. Because this view of education starts with the conviction that it cannot present its own program, but must search for this program dialogically with the people. It serves to introduce the pedagogy of the oppressed, in the elaboration of which the oppressed must participate. Boom. Masterful. Chapter 3. Done. Quickly, we'll just summarize, right? We'll go over what those themes were. Problem-posing education. This is the center theme of how to really educate, and thus how to educate in a liberatory fashion. Because we're so used to education that is not liberatory at all. And that's why people don't show up for streams like these, right? And the goal is that we have to, as educators, and we should all be educators to some degree, by the way, because we should all be students, teachers, and we should all be teachers, students. But the goal is that we should be doing this education instead of through a banking system of education, which chapter 2 talks about how bad that is and how common that is, through a problem-posing education. How do you do problem-posing education? You understand the problems of the students. You understand the problems that we can put forth that the students can understand and talk about. We pose problems out of these thematic ideas that we talk about in class, in our conversations, in our groups. And we say, oh, through this problem, we can understand all these other things. Problem posing. Things to be interacted with by the students who can inform the teachers and by the teachers who can inform the students. And we can do so, also education that can be really good at problem posing education should involve teams of people with different specializations and a bunch of interviews and discussions involving the people from the contexts that we're trying to learn about and teach about to participate in building an investigation. What are we investigating? What are we investigating as educators, as students, as all of us? We should be investigators, but what are we investigating? We're investigating the thematic universes. What does that mean? We're investigating what are the themes of our world. What are the themes of our world universally, and specifically, what are the themes of the people that I'm talking to, the people I'm educating, the people educating me? What are the themes here? So if one of the themes is exploitation of labor, that's a universal theme. If one of the themes is the nature of, AAVE in the TikTok era among the students in a particular classroom who are of that age, that's a much more specific thing that we can draw out to larger themes and that we can start by having a conversation with them about And the way we have a conversation with them about it is by bringing these codifications forward that we've come up with, these codifications through studying, through the investigation, through investigating the context of these students first. We have them interact with those codifications. We pose problems with the themes and with the explanations that they have. And then we together start to have that problem posing educational dialogue. Because education has to be dialogical. And that is that is key to understanding oppression and ending situations of oppression. And in chapter 4, that's where we're going to connect into a larger political view, and larger political understanding. But I'm going to go now. I'm going to grab something to eat really quickly and do some stuff. Thank you all for chilling with me, for listening. I hope you enjoyed this reading of part 2 of chapter 3. And I look forward to doing chapter 4 soon. I'm not sure when, but soon. So stay tuned, okay? See ya.